Next up, we're going to go visit a yarn shop. Now, I don't know about you, but I love visiting yarn shops. It's like a candy store to me. I have fond memories of sitting in yarn shops in Chicago, surrounded by all the colors and the textures, and I want to make everything, you know. I love perusing the aisles and just imagining what can be made with them. So actually, visiting yarn shops is really kind of a thing that I love to do. So one of the few yarn shops that we have in the state of Nebraska is Spindle, Shuttle, and Needle in Stromsburg. Kelsey has been a fiber artist since she was little. Like, she's one of those people that knew what she wanted to do with her life very early on, and so she has a lot of experience and is very knowledgeable, and she has a very interesting story. So let's head on over to the store.
Okay, so Kelsey, why don't you tell us a little about yourself?
Yeah, well, my name is Kelsey Patton, and I have lived here in Stromsburg almost all of my life, except for the first 2 years that I was married to my husband, Philip. And I have a yarn shop called Spindle, Shuttle, and Needle, which just celebrated its 6th birthday. So, I've been selling yarn for quite a while, and teaching people how to knit, teaching people how to spin, and I've been a knitter for quite a bit longer than that. I've been knitting since I was 13, when I told my mom that I wanted to knit a sweater, but first we had to get some sheep. And she found someone to teach me how to knit, and my first project was socks. And then we found some sheep. We got Icelandic sheep, and that kind of, the rest is history. We got a spinning wheel, we got a loom. I started doing all the fiber arts that I could get my hands on, and it's just grown from there.
Well, what is it like to own a yarn shop?
It's a lot more work than people think it is. It's a lot of fun. I really, really love it, but there's all the figuring out what your customers actually want, what's actually going to sell, putting things out on the shelves in an attractive manner, figuring out how to arrange things so that it makes sense. In my shop, I have my shop actually divided between the wool yarns and the wool blend yarns and the non-wool yarns, because there are quite a few people out there who are allergic to wool. So the section of my shop, the wall that has the knitting needles, and then the little shelves that face that wall, all of those yarns have no wool in them. They are all llama and alpaca blends, or mohair, silk, linen, cotton, hemp, things like that, so that people who are allergic to wool can come in and browse a section that they know they're not allergic to and enjoy the shopping experience. But then I really deeply love wool, so the majority of the shop is actually wool, but those are still separated. And I have all sorts of sock yarns and hand paints and beautiful hand-dyed things. I really like it.
Now, how much do you get to actually knit, spin, weave, whatever you want to do?
On an average day in the shop, I don't do much of that, actually. There's a lot of tweaking things on my website, tweaking things on my Etsy store, tweaking things in Square, filtering keywords so that my online shoppers can find my stuff and find the right things. I maybe on an average day during my break over the noon hour, I do give myself a break. I'll eat my lunch, I'll do some knitting, and then I'll go back to all of the business side of things. And then there's some days, like especially in the nice weather season, because I do my hand dyeing in my dad's machine shed, I might take a day where I close the shop and I go out and I play with color and I dye yarn and I dye roving that I sell in the shop. And those are really fun days. It's like you're in kindergarten again. You can just put colors together without having to make perfect lines or anything. It's the joy of the colors.
So how far away do your customers tend to come from?
Well, I would say the bulk of my customers come from within a 30-mile radius, the ones that come to my store on a regular weekly basis. I do have customers that are fairly loyal customers that live further west in the state or live in Lincoln and Omaha, and some of those come out just to come to my shop. Some come to shop at my store and also to spend a day in the town. We have a really nice little cafe that's open over the noon hour. We have some other nice shops that have gift type items, and we have a nice clothing store. So there
Swedish groceries.
Swedish groceries at the grocery store, yes. So we have quite a bit of things within the town to recommend it to the average person who wants to come through. So there are people who make a day of it. They say, oh, well, I want to get yarn, but I'm also going to make a day of it and do other fun things. And then there are the people who come and get yarn from me when they're traveling through. They know, since I'm right on Highway 81 and I'm not too far from the interstate, they know I'm here, and maybe they're traveling from Kansas to South Dakota, and Highway 81 is very convenient, so Stromsburg's their halfway point where they stop and rest a little bit, do some yarn shopping, and then continue on. Or same way for people who travel across the state, west to east or east to west. I become a stopping point then.
Sounds fun.
Online sales, my furthest away sales so far have been from Australia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, in sales, how much would you say is in your store versus online?
I would say it's about 50-50 for what I sell online versus in store. And that varies from month to month. Some months I'll get way more people in the store and very few sales online. And then sometimes it's exactly the opposite. I'll have very few people come through the store, but a lot of sales online. It varies.
I've noticed in recent years a number of yarn stores closing or moving to larger populated places. So what does it take these days to be a successful yarn store?
You have to stay on top of the trends. And you can't just keep everything the same in your store. It's easy to slip into a rut and be like, oh, I've always had this yarn. And but you have to get the new yarns in. It's good to keep the old yarns in, especially if they've been a good seller or if they're a very versatile yarn. There's some yarns that I have that, as long as they are being made, I will keep them. Brown Sheep Lanaloft is a fantastic yarn. You can use it for so many different projects. It's a good price. People like it. It's going to stay here as long as Brown Sheep is in existence. But then, sometimes you get the trends with the novelty yarns, and it's good to jump on the bandwagon and get the novelty yarns, but don't overstock on the novelty yarns.
You'll be stuck with them.
You'll be stuck with them for a very long time. So you have to stay on top of the trends. A thing I like to do is to put up models in my store. I have different scarves and hats and shawls.
There's a hat right behind you.
Yeah, there's a hat
Oh, you're
right
blocking it.
behind me.
There you go.
Here it is. And, this is kind of the slouchy style hat. It doesn't have an extreme slouch. But this is the kind of shape of a hat that people like right now. And this is a very easy project. It takes one ball of yarn. Even very beginner people who can only do knit and purl stitch can do this hat. So you have to have beginner level projects around for the beginner people so that, I can do this. But then you should have some other things around, or I try to keep other projects around that are a little bit more advanced for the people who want to stretch and try something new or make a new project. And it's important to switch out those, I call them models, fairly often. Some of them stay around longer than others. If it's really popular and people are still making it, I keep it because it's, especially the more classic ones. But then there are some things that are a little more trendy. They don't stay around or as long. And then there are some that only stay for about 6 months because I have a model knitters program where some people that I know to be good knitters and responsible people, I send them yarn, they knit an item for my store, I keep it on display for 6 months, and then I send it back to them so that they can then enjoy the item that they put all those hours of knitting into. Because I don't have time to knit all the things I want to have on display in the store.
I can relate.
Yes. And also, it's really valuable because a lot of times I let them choose the pattern or the project. So then it's not just items that are my taste. I say, okay, well, what would you want to knit? Or I'll say, well, I've got this yarn. What would you make out of it? And that's a good thing because they might look at the same yarn a little differently than I do.
True. Very true. Okay. Well, sometimes people get this idea that they want to open a yarn store. And I think most of the time it's people who just think that they can sit and knit all day and make a living.
Oh, yeah.
But if someone was seriously considering starting a yarn store these days, what advice would you give them?
The first advice I would get would be to get some sort of accounting software and learn how to use it. A lot of business plans and sample business plans out there say to get an accountant. If you can afford an accountant, get an accountant, but accountants can be kind of expensive. So QuickBooks has a lot of nice software programs of varying levels for small business owners.
And you have a much better grasp of what's happening in your business if you on
know
top
the
of that
numbers.
yourself. Yeah.
You should always know your numbers. You should know what you can afford when you get new yarn in. And also, pay attention to the trends. And pay attention to what people in your area actually like. I had a yarn sales rep in today, and she showed me some yarns that were just awesome, but I turned them down because I knew that those aren't quite the perfect fit for my town. I think they're crazy awesome yarns or ridiculous, and they're probably a little too ridiculous for the area. Or, I know I would see a yarn and say, oh, I know these 3 people that would like this, but...
Only those 3?
Only those 3. So, it's not a bad thing to get something that only a few people like, but maybe get a smaller quantity of that. And if you're planning to open a yarn shop, don't be afraid to start small. I started with $500. I was graduating from college and I had an extra $500 in my savings account. And I said, okay, I'm going to start a yarn shop. So I got a website set up, and with the website and the domain name and business email, I got a dedicated business email right from the beginning. That was Kelsey@SpindleShuttleandNeedle.com. It took me about a week to settle on my name. But having a dedicated business email makes everything sound and look so much more professional. And then you can also ignore that email after your closing hours for the evening and then bother with it again in the morning. So, and then with the rest of the $500, so at that point I had about $400 that I put into inventory. $400 is a very small amount of inventory. It is a very small amount. And so for the first year, every time I sold something, I just put all my profit back into expanding inventory, 100%. And then as I grew, I still put a lot of the profit back into expanding. But, for my first 2 years, I never went into the red. I didn't really make a good profit for myself to pay myself, but I didn't either go into debt. And I think that's a good way. And starting small is helpful because you don't get overwhelmed. If you try to start big as a full-fledged yarn shop, I think a lot of people get overwhelmed. They didn't realize there's going to be so many bills to keep track of and so many things to keep track of on the website. And it's like when you learn to juggle, you start by tossing one ball back and forth. You don't start with 5.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, not that I can juggle, but...
Yeah, I know of a yarn shop that was their story. Mm-hmm. They opened very big, now they're closed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you could maybe open really big if you already had like a business degree or if you'd run other businesses successfully in the past.
Mm-hmm. And if you could sustain that level of inventory for longer periods of time before you are profitable.
Yeah.
It would take you longer to be profitable with a, say, 3 times the size of what you have now.
Yeah, it would be. And, don't be afraid if something isn't selling to throw it on the clearance rack and not get it again. And, I mean, there are certain things that don't sell very quickly that you kind of just got to keep on the shelves when you're a yarn shop, like basic stitch markers. You're not going to make your store profit line on stitch markers generally. But you should keep those so that when a customer comes in and they go, oh, I'm getting all this yarn. Oh, wait, I think I have lost all my stitch markers. Then there's one that you have packaged right there that they can pick up.
It's an add-on.
It's an add-on.
Yeah. Whatever you want to say.
I don't know what I want to say now.
Your favorite yarns.
Okay, so this is one of my favorite yarns, and I have done a lot of projects with this. This is Araucania Huasco, and it is made in Chile by Araucania Yarn Company. And it is 100% merino, and it's fingering weight, and has 450 yards on a skein, on a 100-gram skein. So you get a lot of yardage, which means you can make pretty nice sized projects with just one skein. It's $24.95 a skein, but when you can make an entire cowl or a small shawl out of one skein, that actually turns out into quite an economical project. And it's got the hand paint colors like this, and then it's also got the tonal colors, which are kettle dyed, so that you get different shades of the same color on it. So you can get different effects, like this one, which I made with two colors. The green is a tonal, which overall you get the effect of a solid, but you can see there's a little bit of shifting in the hue, or in the shading, I guess. So it doesn't just look like a boring flat. There's depth. And then this variegated was this color. And a lot of times if you're doing a project and you love a variegated yarn, variegateds can be very overwhelming on their own. You just end up looking like an entire giant blotchy thing. But you pair it like this one, where you've got stripes with the variegated and the solid, it's much less overwhelming, and the bright green pulls out the green in the variegated, and it's very nice. So this is probably one of my top selling yarns, and it is, I have done so many projects in this Huasco that it's not even funny anymore, but it's one of my go-to yarns because it's very soft, it's very nice around the neck, and you can get a lot out of one skein. One of my other favorite yarns, and this is probably actually the #1 bestseller of all time in my shop. It is one of the first yarns that I started carrying when I first opened, and it is the Brown Sheep Lanaloft. And it is made by the Brown Sheep Company in Mitchell, Nebraska, and I carry the worsted weight. It also comes in a sport weight and a bulky weight, but I carry the worsted weight because that's the most versatile for me. And bulky gets a bit heavy. So it is in a 3.5 ounce skein, or 100 grams. It has about 160 yards in skein. And it comes in 3 different types of colors, or at least that I carry in my store. You have the solids, and some of the solids are a little bit heathered, so you have a little bit of depth of color there. But overall, you're going to have a solid color effect when you knit. And then there are the what they call the monochromes, or what I would call a tonal, which are kind of kettle dyed so that you get different shades of the same color on the same skein. And this is going to have a little bit of a blotchy effect when you work with it, but not, it'll all be different shades of the same color, so it's not going to be overwhelming. And then they have their hand paints. Their hand paints are actually rather famous. A lot of people really like their hand paints. They come up with their own colorways there. And they paint the skeins with different shades, so you have a standard variegated yarn. And being hand dyed, they do vary from dye lot to dye lot, so if you would order some from me, get enough all at once. If you need 6, because you can see I only carry 3 of each normally, I'll order in 6 for you of the same dye lot and make sure it all comes so it all matches for you. And it's not a problem to order things in. And I've got actually a couple of projects that I or other people have done. I did this hat. This is the Norway hat. It's a free pattern on Ravelry. And it has a special stitch structure to it. It's knit. That really breaks up variegated yarns. So a lot of times when you work with variegated, you'll get what's called pooling, where, especially if you're knitting in the round, every time you come around, your yellow stacks up on top of your yellow, and your blue stacks up on top of your blue, and your red stacks up on top of your red, and then you've got like vertical stripes or great big blobs of color, which can be a very cool effect. But not everyone likes that. So this pattern, since you actually knit into stitches from the previous row and pull loops up, it really breaks it up. So you get a very nice mottled effect of all the different colors, and it kind of looks like small jewels all over. And this one is a very famous pattern. It is the Baa-ble hat, which was the hat released for Shetland Wool Week in, I think in 2015. It was the Shetland Wool Week pattern. And it is a paid pattern on Ravelry. I think it's about $6 or $8 to get this pattern. And you can see this was knit by one of my customers, and she's letting me have it in the store for the foreseeable future. We used some of the solid brown sheep Lanaloft for this section, but we used one of the variegateds for the top in the color Twilight. Something Twilight. Yeah, Twilight. And since this is the sky, and it's supposed to look like a stormy day where it's starting to snow, we've got the blue, we've got the gray, we've got the brown. It's really pretty. I really like her color choice there. So, that is Brown Sheep Lanaloft. So, another one of my favorite yarns, and probably the one that's actually closest to my heart, is this yarn, which is our Blue River Icelandic Lopi. I mentioned earlier that my family ended up getting sheep. Well, we got Icelandic sheep. And Icelandic sheep are a primitive breed. They're basically the same as when the Vikings brought them to Iceland around the year 1000. So they still have a dual coat, where they have the long hairy outer coat called the tog and the downy soft inner coat called the thel. And traditionally the Vikings separated those. They would use the tog to make sails and sacks and things that needed to be really strong and rough wearing. And then they would use the thel for next to the skin and clothing because it's downy and soft. It can even approach the same micron size as like ultrafine merino. It's really soft. But somewhere along the line, they discovered that you can, I don't think the Vikings did, I think the Icelanders did later, that you can spin both together as a single. And what happens is that the tog, being much longer than the thel, will actually migrate towards the middle while the downy soft fibers kind of get wrapped around the outside. This is not 100% that it does this, but generally that will happen. So you have basically a core of really strong tog, which is hairy, and then all that downy fuzziness is wrapped around the outside, and they call that yarn Lopi. And so we've been having our yarn, or we send our wool to the mill every year now and have it made into Lopi, which is a really good seller.
You use the Shepherd's Mill, right?
We used Shepherd's Mill this year. Previous year we used Morningstar Mill out in North Carolina. Both mills do a fantastic
Last
job.
week's episode had the Shepherd's Mill in it.
Oh, Shepherd's Mill is really fun. And that's the only mill I've been to. We, of course, did not drive our fleeces out to Morningstar, and that is a large part of why we ended up bringing our stuff to the Shepherd's Mill, because we could hand deliver our fleeces and talk with the people about what we wanted exactly. And Sally, being very knowledgeable about yarn and fiber arts, knew exactly what we were trying to go for and produced lovely, lovely yarn. This is some that she spun. And so we have 100 gram skeins of the Lopi, and we have it mostly in the natural colors of the sheep, because Icelandic sheep come in different colors because they're primitive. The most prevalent color is white. So we have the most white sheep, we have the most white yarn. But they also come in natural black, and they also come in gray, and they also come in a color called moret, which is a brown. And we don't have very many moret sheep. So we had the moret blended with some of the gray fleeces. So we have a moret gray, and it's this very light, soft brown color. It's just lovely. It's just yummy. And then we dye some of the white too into kind of natural earthy colors to mimic natural dyes that the Vikings had. So we have the green, we have the pale lavender, we have the soft pink, we have the golden yellow, we have the woad blue, and we have kind of a more bright burgundy red. So, and we dye those in batches of 4. We can do 4 at a time. So we can get very close to the same color, especially if we do several batches in a day, by measuring and being very scientific with our dyeing process. But the 4 that we do together are going to match the best.
And you dye them yourself?
We dye them ourselves.
Okay.
My mom and I both do the dyeing, but she's been doing most of the dyeing of the Icelandic lately. And these skeins are 100 yards, and they're about 4.2 ounces, give or take. And it's supposed to take a size 8 to 10 needle. And the undyed retails the natural colors for $27.95, and then the dyed is $29.95. And this is grown on our own farm just outside of Stromsburg, on our own sheep, and we're very involved in every step of the process.
And their guard llama came from me.
Yes, we have a guard llama, and his name is Liam. And he came from Tashia, and he's finally starting to warm up to me. For a long time, I think he had a pretty extreme case of stranger danger, but I've discovered he likes fresh green pasture grass. So, we only just a few days ago let our flock out into pasture. But, so before we were letting the flock out into pasture, I'd go get a handful and bring it to him, and he'd be very happy about that. So now he comes right up to the fence wondering if I've got another treat for him. Another thing I do a lot of is I dye wool top. And a lot of people call this roving. And roving is not, like, super wrong. It is often called roving online. It is called roving by Etsy. But the technical difference between top and roving is that roving is a carded process and top is a combed process. Top is a combed process. So when you card, you have a big drum carder, and it gets pulled off, and all the fibers are kind of more or less aligned, but they're also kind of going higgledy-piggledy all over the place. Where with comb top, it is combed, so all the fibers are perfectly aligned. And comb top is often quite a bit thicker than roving. Roving is usually really thin, and kind of, you hold up a strip of it, and you can see through it. Top is very thick. You can see this is one strand of top. It's like someone's ponytail. So, one of the reasons that I dye top rather than roving is because since it's thicker, it holds together better, so I can lay it out on a table and paint it. And painting roving is one of my favorite things to do. And I do this out in my dad's machine shed right now because I got really tired of doing this in my kitchen and spilling dye on the floor. It doesn't matter if I spill it on the rock floor of his machine shed. And eventually, I'm going to have a dye studio or dye shack where I can keep my stuff up all the time. But right now, I dye seasonally when it's warm weather outside. And I really like playing with all the colors. I like to look at inspiration photos. This one came from an inspiration photo where it was a really dark, stormy cloud with red light poking around it, and it's called Red at Morning. And then sometimes I just look at a color wheel, or because I know my dyes, because I've done it quite a while, I know which dyes will look good together, and like these I know that these colors will blend into each other well, and so that's how I did that one. But sometimes I just spray the colors on, or squirt the colors on, and they wait to see how they come out. And it can be a lot of fun. And most of my top that I dye is a Colombian and Rambouillet wool blend. And it comes from the Brown Sheep Company out of Mitchell, Nebraska. So it comes from sheep that are grown in western Nebraska and Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, South Dakota, that area. So most of this is U.S. grown. And it hasn't traveled very far to come to me to become my dyed top. I do have a few other fiber blends though. This is Polwarth, 21 to 24 micron. It's very fine. Polwarth is a breed of sheep that you mostly find down in Australia. And a Polwarth sheep is 3/4 Merino and 1/4 another breed of sheep, which I can never remember. I also have Merino and silk, and you can see the shininess in it from the silk. And of course you know what Merino is, or most of you probably know what it is. A very large breed of sheep that has super fine, very soft wool. I also have, this is one of my new fibers that I've been dyeing, a 50/50 alpaca and silk blend, which is very, very slippery to work with. Not like for spinning, but for dyeing purposes. But it's really fun, and it's really pretty. It's very shiny, very, very soft. I'm probably going to keep this in the store, even though it's kind of a pain to dye, because it is just so awesome as a finished product. Since I dye roving, I also dye yarn, because I had a lot of people coming into my store and saying, "Oh, your roving," technically top, "your roving is so beautiful. I wish that I could buy that in yarn form because I don't spin." And I said, well, that's a really good idea. So last spring I started to dye yarn, and I have some sock yarn in the store that I've dyed and done in some of the painted colors. But then I've also started doing some kettle dyeing, and this is on Brown Sheep Lamb's Pride base, so it's 85% wool and 15% mohair. And it's kettle dyed because I put this down into a roaster or a crock pot or some other container, like a kettle, and I pour my dye over the yarn and let it cook. And I have to be careful not to stir it during that whole time. It takes about 45 minutes to cook. And when you kettle dye, you get a lot of the colors kind of running into each other. So you get the gold blending into the green. You get the browns blending into the green. We have all the plums and the berries and the purples that blend together, but then there's still different sections that are distinctly the colors that I put on. Like here's the lavender and here's the green, and then here's the in-between colors where we have kind of the earthy purple. So I've been having a lot of fun with that. And all of my hand-dyed yarn and my hand-dyed top you can find on Etsy, on my Etsy shop. I do put these on my website also, but I usually keep the Etsy shop up a little bit more to date because people who are browsing and searching for dyed top or dyed yarn anymore, they mostly tend to go to Etsy first to look. So it's easier for me to reach the people who want my yarn there.
If you're interested in getting any of Kelsey's products, you can buy them on her website at spindleshuttleneedle.com and also in her Etsy store, which is called Petals and Treadles.